Welcome. Today I'm going to take you through a presentation that was given at the University of Hawaii to a class of language arts teacher candidates last spring. The presentation was about global literature, the pitfalls and the possibilities. You can see the cover here. And the class was comprised of about 20 teacher candidates in Hawaii. Some of them were from Hawaii, many of them were from the US mainland. One or two might have been international. And that's about it. The course was delivered online. However, it was not recorded, which is why I'm recording it here today. Today's version is a slightly abridged version of the 30-minute presentation that is missing a lot of the discussion, but I'll go through some of the discussion with you. Here we go. So when we talk about global education, we often pay lip service to a number of benefits that are listed here. The literature on it and teachers who talk about it often talk about broadening readers' horizons, which of course we want to do. We talk about global citizenship. We talk about promoting global citizenship. This is a purpose of global education. We talk about teaching tolerance, and we believe that global education will encourage a sense of common humanity. This is, again, both in the literature on this topic and something we talk about as teachers. So here I have a few popular selections. Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis is a popular selection of global literature. Epic of Gilgamesh, a text of ancient Babylon, which is included on some global literature texts, and A Long Way Home, which is a book of nonfiction about a boy soldier's story. All pretty amazing texts I would encourage you to take a look at. I introduced these benefits to you as a way to talk about our goals in including global literature in our curriculum and in teaching global education, but also I want you to reflect a little bit on the limitations and some of the pitfalls with these benefits. We don't necessarily hit these educational goals simply by including the text in our curriculum, but we can sometimes achieve it if we teach it well by encouraging students to investigate and understand some of the cultural differences they might encounter, and also to take a look at some of the similarities. So that's how we promote this real engagement with the global. So when we talk about operationalizing global education, there are actually few ways to do this. So here I would pose the question to students: how do we operationalize global education? Where do you see global education in action? So many students will say they see it in study abroads. That's usually the first place a lot of students go. Fewer students would mention the international campuses that are becoming popular now in China and in the US, joint campuses across countries and continents. Fewer students still might mention the curricular ways that we promote global education. The International Baccalaureate curriculum, which is the transnational curriculum offered by the International Baccalaureate, is one way that we see global education. The PISA tests, which arose in the early 2000s and kicked off a lot of our conversations about global education, is another way that we see global education in action, in the concrete. But beyond that, there are actually a few ways, and global literature, which is the topic today, is one of the ways that we see global education in action. So the term world literature is something that I want my students to have and to understand. So world literature is a course that is sometimes taught at the high school level and is sometimes taught also at the post-secondary level in English departments. And it is a term that first arose back in 1827 by Goethe, who said that an epic of world literature is at hand. He was speaking German, so world literature comes from the German. And this term arose because he observed that there were certain authors, like Franz Kafka, who successfully crossed national borders and actually found a greater readership outside of his home country than in his home country. So the world literature, this transnational border crossing type of literature. The term rose in popularity after World War I, particularly in the US, when teachers and countrymen realized that, oh my goodness, there's this big wide world out there that our students need to learn about. The course in world literature arose, it's important to note, it arose at the same time as the course in American literature. We don't often talk about that. So while American literature was there to cover, not quite 200 years of history and just one country, world literature was supposed to cover 5,000 years of literary history and a much greater, much more diverse geography. So we already see here a little bit of an imbalance. The term regained in popularity after World War II, where again there was this resurgence, this reawareness in the wider world. And at that time, world literature, particularly in academia, retracted into what we know today as comparative literature or area studies. So area studies experts who were familiar in Middle Eastern literature or African literature, what have you, they became experts in their corners of world literature, because world literature is so gargantuan and impossible for one person to do. The 1960s to the 1990s is remembered as the time of the culture wars, which arguably we're still in. So this was a time when there was a war in a lot of English departments over the canon, which some refer to as the dead white men, the canon, mainly European literature, and emerging literature, both domestically and abroad. The term world literature again regained, there was a renewed interest in world literature again after 9/11, 2001, where again there was a kind of global awareness. There was an interest in greater global awareness. So this is kind of the history of this term world literature, and later on in the presentation I'll talk a little bit about world literature relative to other terms, global literature. But I do want you to know where this term comes from in case you have to teach a course on this, in case you have to teach a text that might be called world literature. So you should know that there are a lot of challenges with teaching world literature, and they're well documented. There is, first of all, a lack of translations. There is a great appetite for translations out of English into other languages, and less of a market for translations from non-English into English language texts. So there's immediately a challenge just with access to texts. In addition to that, I've already talked a little bit about the scope, the enormous scope of world literature. No one teacher can possibly know the world and be an expert on Japanese literature as well as Nigerian plays, as well as Persian poetry, right? It's just an impossible gargantuan task. And if you take a look at the anthologies of global literature that are well over 1,000 pages, you can see the great difficulty. As you cross borders, there are different genres, there are different senses of humor, there are different tropes. And so a foreign reader, a reader who's trying to access a foreign text might not get those, might not appreciate those as well. There is also an issue with teacher training. So in a lot of our teacher education programs, we simply don't teach how to teach global literature. We don't teach the texts and new texts and emerging texts. And so teachers tend to teach the texts they were taught and perpetuate old curriculum. There is an issue with cultural differences that sometimes emerge even in the selection of particular texts. And there's a bias that can be detected even there in that initial stage of selecting texts. Then there's even further back, there's issues with Western definitions of literature. A lot of indigenous literature, a lot of indigenous traditions are rooted in orality and the oral tradition and might not have been written down. So this is another issue that emerges. And finally, it can be boring for students, kind of related to some of these cultural differences and different genres and senses of humor. Students are not going to really necessarily get it. It will be harder. It will be an uphill battle. And in being an uphill battle, it might be a little boring. So lots and lots of challenges. It can be done, but you should know that there are a lot of challenges to teaching global literature. So at this point, I would stop and have students share a little bit about their experiences teaching global texts. What texts have they taught? How did it go? What challenges did you experience? What successes did you experience? So students in the US would talk a lot about texts. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart is a popular text that's widely read. It does a good job of describing the culture within the text so that it eliminates those cultural differences. Other students might talk about, some students in the past have read the Persepolis, which is a popular book. And many texts, there's an 11th grade textbook that is devoted to global literature. So many students might refer to those texts there. But anyway, this part here is an opportunity for me to get to know students' contexts and to learn a little bit about students' experiences and for them to also share with each other. One of the hot button issues when we talk about global literature is this issue of cultural authenticity. Who gets to write a book about a culture or country? So the question is, who is a cultural insider and who is a cultural outsider? So these terms, cultural insider refers to an author who is ethnically of that culture being written about, not just a resident, but ethnically related to that culture being written about. Whereas a cultural outsider refers to an author who is ethnically not of that culture or nation. This cultural outsider could include those who have heavily researched the culture, who are heavily invested in the culture. They are still considered cultural outsiders. So here I have several texts relevant to the Hawaii context. James Michener's Hawaii, which was a book published in the year of Hawaii statehood, written by a cultural outsider. Herman Melville's Taipei, written by Herman Melville, a sojourner through Hawaii, a cultural outsider, and then more recently, Paul Theroux's Hotel Honolulu, which presents these colorful characters in Hawaii through the lens of someone who is very much not of Hawaii. So it brings up these issues which are very salient to teachers in Hawaii and are important to consider when we select our books for the classroom. So a few definitions I want my students to be aware of, that I want you to be aware of. World literature, which I've already talked a lot about, refers to any literature of the world, any time period, any country. It's a kind of broad term, and it has been widely critiqued because it's so amorphous as to be meaningless. Global literature refers to literature, particularly K-12, particularly literature read in the K-12 setting, that is set in a place other than the reader's own. So, for example, if we have a picture book set in Egypt that is being read in the US, that would be global. That would be considered global literature. Similarly, the other texts I mentioned, A Long Way Home, this is a story set in Africa. So it would be set outside of the American reader's experience. Multicultural literature refers to domestic literature about an ethnic minority. And international literature refers to literature representing literature of another country, of another nation's tradition. But all of these terms get very confused when we talk about borders changing sometimes, and borders changing particularly over time, and colonization of one country over another. So while these are definitions for these terms, you should be aware that there are a lot of gray areas even within these definitions. So here I'm going to offer the abridged version of the full presentation. Here I described the experiences of several teachers, their experience of teaching global literature. And so some of the lessons learned, one is that many teachers had difficulty implementing international or global literature. They came across many of the challenges that I spoke of earlier in this presentation. Teachers who succeeded often made connections to the local, to the local place, to the students' own experiences. So personal experiences were leveraged to make connections to literature as far back as Epic of Gilgamesh. Sometimes some teachers did it by making connections to religion, not the same religion, but different religions, but by making connections thematically. I'm going to now skip ahead to the final slides of the presentation. We have just a few more minutes. So at the end, I would ask students a few questions. What surprised you about these teachers' experiences? What questions do you have about their experiences or their curriculum? Do you think what they were doing was really international literature? How might you broaden the current text selections in your classroom or at your school? And that's kind of the big question. But in addition to this, I did also want to present curriculum. So this is curriculum and texts that were highlighted at a professional development opportunity that was organized by me and jointly with the Asian Studies Department at the University of Hawaii. So one text that is absolutely worthy of the classroom is Rickshaw Boy by Lao She. This was published in 1936. It is a modern Chinese text, and it is great for the 10th grade classroom, written straightforwardly, a little long, 300 pages, but the story tells one of a young boy who recently moved from the country to Beijing, to the big city of Beijing, to make his fortune. It explores the themes of individualism versus the collective. And ultimately, it's the story of the American dream. So it's well read against texts like The Great Gatsby and Of Mice and Men, but similar stories taking place in very different times and places and in different cultures. So a very nice juxtaposition and comparison. A couple of short stories I'd like to bring to your attention. Hands by Zhao Hong. It is a tragic and funny short story about bullying and about class differences. It explores themes that many students can relate to, and it is engaging enough that you could read it in the class, probably over a couple of different days. Iron Child by Mo Yan rather, is a magical realistic. This one you would not want to read in the class. It's pretty dark and serious, but it is told in a magical realistic style. So it lends itself to a lot of good discussion about what is actually going on in this text. It tells the story of children, very young children, who were abandoned during a time of poverty in China. And it could be worthy of an honors class because of the difficulty in determining kind of what's going on and the ambiguity there. And that is it. Yes, I did have other resources. So other resources I'd like to bring to your attention. The University of Arizona has a website with reading lists, global literature reading lists that are worthy of taking a look at. It's Kathy Short over there has spent a lot of years of her life dedicated to this project. Finally, the International Baccalaureate has quite an extensive reading list on European and non-European texts that is worthy of taking a look at, and there's a link there. So thank you very much, and I hope you learned a little something about world literature and global education today. Thank you.